In the spring of 1941, Europe was under the control of the Third Reich. Poland, Scandinavia, France, all following years of lightning victories. But for Hitler, war was more than just geopolitics. It was ideology. The destruction of the Bolshevik USSR, the conquest of living space, and access to the agricultural and raw material riches of the East were part of the Reich's long-term vision. The operation was formally sanctioned by the Führer with Directive Number 21 of December 18, 1940. Accompanying orders were issued in the spring of 1941. Particularly eloquent was the Barbarossa Directive and accompanying documents, including the Charter on the War of Extermination and the Commissar Order, which legalized cruelty against the enemy's political leadership. It was a plan not only to seize territory, but also to ideologically eliminate the regime. When the first artillery salvos rang out at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, millions of men were participating in the offensive. Official German plans called for a massive offensive by three strategic fists: Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South, each with its own objective and route of advance, toward Leningrad, Moscow, and southward toward Ukraine and the Caucasus. The total Axis force at the outset was estimated at several million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft. Army Group North, primarily under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, was tasked with advancing through the Baltics and capturing Leningrad. Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, aimed to break through to Smolensk and then to Moscow. The center was the focus of the strategic strike. Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and other marshals at various stages, advanced on Kyiv and the southern regions to cut off Ukrainian industry and agricultural regions. Motorized corps and tank armies operated in the rear and on the flanks, commanded by such outstanding tank commanders as Heinz Guderian, Ernst Busch, Heinrich Hott, and others, men whose names would become household words in the history of the blitzkrieg. The plan envisioned a simultaneous disruption of Soviet defenses along the entire width of the border. Aircraft launched massive strikes against airfields and communication centers, while armored spearheads swiftly cut through the Russian front, encircling armies into pockets. A classic blitzkrieg tactic. The first few weeks already brought significant successes. Vast territories fell under German control. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled. Railways and communications were paralyzed. Step by step, the Wehrmacht inflicted heavy defeats on the Red Army in border battles. One of the most significant episodes was the encirclement and surrender of Soviet troops near Kyiv. In September 1941, the Germans took hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Estimates point to around 600,000 captured Soviet troops by the end of the Battle of Kyiv, one of the most astonishing figures of the campaign. The number of prisoners and the loss of material resources proved a monstrous blow. One of the key and grim aspects of the campaign's opening was the nature of the orders that accompanied the offensive. The Barbarossa Decree, issued in March 1941, and the Commissar Order prescribed harsh measures against partisans, communist leaders, and commissars, their arrests and executions without trial. This framework transformed the operation not simply into a military campaign, but into a police and ideological purge of enemies of the Reich behind the lines of the captured territories. These orders subsequently became the basis for war crimes on the Eastern Front. At the outset, the Wehrmacht had a combination of motorized divisions, tank spearheads, Panzer I and III. By the start of the operation, the Panzer IV was used as a medium. Luftwaffe aircraft, Bf-109, Ju-87 Stuka, He-111, etc. Mechanized troops and enormous ammunition reserves, compared to the Red Army in some sectors. The Panzer III and IV tanks became the workhorses of armored operations. The light Panzer I and II tanks served in support roles. Soviet tank fleets featured a large number of vehicles and the introduction of new types, especially the T-34 and the heavy KV-1, which the Germans greeted with apprehension. However, in 1941, many Soviet tanks still suffered from logistics, poor radio communications, and crew training issues. According to statistics, the USSR lost tens of thousands of tanks in 1941, including several thousand T-34 and KV tanks, many of which failed not in combat but due to breakdowns and problems with repairs and evacuation. The T-34 proved to be a breakthrough model in the long run, but in the first months it was still unable to turn the tide on its own. Furthermore, climate and distance played a role. German logistics were designed for rapid breakthroughs, but were vulnerable in the conditions of a protracted campaign and the Rasputitsa, mud, spring and autumn mud, and ultimately the European winter, for which the Germans were unprepared. June-July 1941. Border battles and a rapid breakthrough. The Germans routed many Soviet border formations, capturing border airfields and roads. August-September 1941. Smolensk, encirclements, and Kyiv. The battles for Smolensk delayed the advance of the center, but the Germans managed to organize large encirclements, particularly in the Kyiv area, where approximately 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. These encirclements deprived the Red Army of significant forces. Autumn 1941. Offensive on Moscow, Operation Typhoon. Despite fatigue and logistical problems, German troops reached the outskirts of the capital by late autumn. Battles near Moscow, the capture of key junctions, and heavy fighting at Mozhaisk and Vyazma. However, winter conditions and Soviet resistance halted the advance. Winter 1941 to 1942. Moscow counterattack and the arrival of winter. On December 5, 1941, a large-scale Soviet counteroffensive operation, the Winter Campaign of 1941 to 1942 began, resulting in the Germans being pushed back from the gates of Moscow. Their advance stalled, and many units suffered heavy losses due to freezing temperatures, frosts, and a shortage of winter clothing. Another tragic aspect of the campaign was the fate of Soviet prisoners of war. During individual battles, for example Kyiv, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. By the end of 1941 to 1942, millions of Soviet prisoners of war ended up in German concentration or detention camps, and a huge number died of hunger, cold, and execution. Worldwide research indicates that approximately 2.6 to 3.0 million Soviet prisoners of war died in Nazi captivity. Overall, prisoner and civilian losses on the Eastern Front amounted to enormous numbers, one of the most difficult chapters of World War II. For the Nazi leadership, the operation was an ideological war against Judeo-Bolshevism and a tool for expanding their Lebensraum. Military circles largely shared the confidence that the Red Army would be quickly broken. The historic speed of victories over France fueled this self-assurance. The plan was to reach the AA line, Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan, through a punitive redistribution of the continent. However, practice confronted a harsh reality. Logistics, climate, the vastness of the USSR's territory and its resource base made the task insurmountable within the blitzkrieg formula. For the Soviet leadership, the blow of June 22 was a shock. The political repressions of 1937 to 1938 had weakened the officer corps, and mobilization and deployment had been partially unsuccessful. Nevertheless, the Soviet state managed to quickly restructure mobilization and industrial mechanisms, evacuating industrial enterprises deep into the country, transferring reserves from Siberia, partly after receiving intelligence about Japan, and decisively mobilizing the population. By late 1941, the Red Army was already demonstrating its ability to quickly recover and launch strategic counterattacks, which manifested itself in the winter counteroffensive. The Allies, especially Britain, were unable to launch a significant attack in the East in 1941, but they provided diplomatic and material support, from convoys to the Arctic to the Lend-Lease program, which officially began delivering supplies to the USSR in October 1941. By late 1941 and early 1942, the USSR was receiving trucks, fuel, equipment, and units through Lend-Lease, which helped maintain the Red Army's mobility and infrastructure. This wasn't decisive in terms of the fighting of 1941, but it laid the foundation for long-term cooperation and supply. Hitler publicly and in private doctrines explained the why: the destruction of the Jewish Bolshevik regime, the expansion of Lebensraum, and the economic consideration of the East as Germany's grain and energy storehouse. In directives and speeches, he envisioned the Eastern War as a thorough cleansing of Europe from the ideological scourge. These directives were accompanied by directives calling for a merciless struggle against the USSR's political elite and harsh measures against the population. This soon culminated in punitive actions and mass crimes. The stories of individual soldiers, officers, and civilians paint a human picture. German tank crews enthusiastically speaking of new spaces, Soviet soldiers trying to hold back the onslaught, female workers in evacuated factories, families and refugees being sent to Siberia. Gerd von Bach's officer's diary, Guderian's frontline notes, and the memoirs of Soviet commanders convey a mixture of pride, fear, calculation, and horror. These were people who lived and died at the very center of history. Winter 1941 to 1942, the turning point. By midwinter, it became clear the operation, designed for a quick rout, had suffered a strategic failure. The Soviet counterattack near Moscow in December 1941 pushed German units back from the city's outskirts. The Wehrmacht found itself overextended with supply problems, without adequate winter gear, and in extreme cold. This was the first real strategic setback in Hitler's ambitions. The plan to capture Moscow, which he had insisted on, failed, and the war entered a protracted and bloody phase. Germany captured large territories and inflicted heavy material and human losses on the USSR, but failed to achieve its strategic goal, the destruction of Soviet statehood and superiority in the East. The Soviet Union experienced the catastrophe of the first months, but managed to mobilize, re-equip its industry, and in late 1941, launch a successful counterattack near Moscow. The number of prisoners, the atrocities unleashed, and the policy of war of annihilation left deep wounds and paved the way for a long and bitter struggle. Millions of people paid with their lives and health. The advent of Lend-Lease and material aid from the Allies strengthened Soviet reserves and logistics, which significantly impacted the course of the war in the medium term.